Hi, this is Joe Satriani, and you're watching Loudguitars.com.
Hi, this is Rick Corvese, and I'm the winner of Loudguitars.com's private lesson with Joe Satriani. I'm coming 25 years. I wanted to meet you, and the story of you with Hendrix, you were like my Hendrix for me. So I guess essentially what I would love to, I mean, it's hard to put 25 years into an hour, so I think what would be fantastic and fun would be to, I guess, take some of the, learn some licks directly from you, from some of my favorite songs to, I'm sure they're incorrect or I can't do them anywhere near what you could do, of course, and it would just be fantastic to learn from you instead of all of the inaccurate tabs that are out there.
Okay.
So this is my first guitar lesson ever, so I think it's pretty
wow,
fitting.
Okay. So usually if I'm giving a lesson, I have to find out what the student can do. So what can you do? Sounds good so far.
So that's,
that sounds really good so
stop
far.
There.
That's
so
great.
I'm really nervous. My hands feel like glue. I don't know what
yeah.
happens, but just that weird moment of your music's fantastic. It's inspired me for years now. So I just would love to, I guess in a perfect world, besides just being your full-time student and stuff. But I think just learning some certain things. Like there's a couple of riffs that are difficult and so a little bit of improvising, maybe a little bit of help. I feel like because I've been playing by ear my whole life, I understand basic theory and basic stuff, and I understand the shapes, but to be honest with you, I would just love to know that kind of little missing piece that maybe will help me with my improvising to help me take me that next level.
Sure, yeah. Well, there's lots of little things that I think we all pick up along the way that really go and take us a distance. That if you look at it on paper, you go, well, that's nothing. That's a little hint. But actually, when I sit here and I watch somebody play something that I know very well, that I still work on every night. I'm always working on Satch Boogie. I'm always trying to figure out a better way to do it. But when I watch somebody else play it, I can see former versions of myself. Let's say the first time I started writing it, I wasn't quite sure I could pull it off, if it would sound like a song when I was done, which notes I should leave out, where was it inadequate, where it needed to sit back, where it needed to move forward. And what I relied on was all these little things that I picked up from playing with other people, from playing in front of lots of audiences and getting their reaction. So the first couple of things that I noticed right away was that you could have used like 20% more swing sitting on the backbeat. Jeff Campitelli on the drums, man, that guy is like the Cadillac of swing. He always finds the furthest place in the back to make it very comfortable. So when you go to play with him, you've got to almost take the position that you're in the trunk, right? Because he he's already presenting you with a very sort of like this. He doesn't play like this, you know. He kind of plays like this.
Yeah, and just
so
kinda-
for you to sound not kind of nervous, you have to figure out to get back there with him,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so you're leaving your strings way too early, you know. So instead of, you know, you're thinking of, I'm going to do this really plain here. Just that, I'm really milking it for everything I can get out of it. And that's what I'm, instead of
Trying to slow it down. Yeah.
it's really short. Now I probably can't even play it stiff anymore because I've played it so long swinging it. You see, I'm really doing a swing kind of a thing.
Just kind of like a little more groovy like
Yeah,
that.
you just try to make it as good and bend a little bit more. Every time you're presented with a third, you kind of, you know, you play the, you're doing a little funny thing with the third. That's the blues idiom, you know. The other thing would be, the two things that I noticed that were very interesting is that your right hand stayed in the exact same place for every section. Now, if I was writing this out for manuscript, I would have a million little indications about what to
Where
do
you
with
should
that.
put this. Yeah.
So my right hand is moving all the time.
Because of the harp-like sounds you can get by traveling up towards the
Exactly.
neck.
So
Yeah.
I'll have to put the gain up for you to hear how different it sounds when I'm doing that. So you do have to kind of memorize this little
Yeah,
section.
where those harmonics
so
are.
you've got root, third, fifth, minor seventh, root, and then major nine. And that little section there just is that way.
Oh, I see. Yeah,
So
okay.
that's just
I
going
get it.
in the opposite direction
Right,
there.
right, right.
So you kind of have to think about that as you're playing. Because I always want those harmonics to be very musical. I want them to fit.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
So I would say that. The other thing is the vibrato is a little automatic. I took some bebop lessons from a guy named Lenny Tristano, and one day he asked me, "Can you just play a note without doing anything to it, without any nervous twitch, right?" And I realized that I'd never just hit a note. I just never do that. I was always shaking and doing something to it. And I thought, wow, all these years I've been playing, and I'm not quite sure I know how to just hit a note and make it sound good. So that put me on a path for many years where I taught myself how to play without putting any, what we used to call English on it, you know. But it's just no vibrato or any affectation of style, and see what it sounds like to just hear the pure note. And then after that, make an artistic decision that you improvise in the moment. What does that note need? Does it need shaken? Fast, slow? Does
It
need
kind of
to be
will write
slurred?
itself almost.
Well, you want to
when you're
improvise
in
it,
the
I
zone.
think, if you adopt that artistic lifestyle of improvising, but you don't want it to be automatic to where you say, this is my vibrato, and every note I hit always has
Agreed.
that.
Yeah,
You can't tell a story instrumentally by having the same message. The other thing is that in that particular song, you know, it's basically blues in A, and you're playing it in the same key it was recorded in. I'm a half step down, of course, but the idea was to play around with the fact that it's a blues scale. It is sort of a Dorian with an added major third and an augmented fourth thrown in there. Lots of ways to look at it, but I do some key changes in there, and each time I try to lean on some other notes that are part of it, and that I think is what defines the song from, let's say, a lot of other boogie songs. And this is always the problem when you do a blues song. So let's say if we were doing a straight ahead blues and we're going to call it the Red Velvet Blues, because we're surrounded by red velvet here, right? So the only thing that makes it different is that we've called it the Red Velvet Blues, and so people will expect us to sing them a story about why we're talking about red velvet, right? So the instrumentalist, of course, doesn't have that. We don't have any language to use, but we do have the musical language. So what's going to make this different, musically speaking, than when you write something about blue burlap, you know, or, you know, orange stone? You know, if you're doing all blues songs, you have to say, well, I've got the scales and the way that I play it and the inflection, and am I pushing, am I sitting on the beat, am I in the back beat, you know, you need to have a command of all these teeny little things that maybe the audience doesn't know is going on, you know, in the mechanics of your playing. But you as the player have to take total control over it, just the way a singer would, because a singer could sing Red Velvet a million different ways and give you a different impression. You know, they could sing it with anger, they could sing it with fear, they can sing it with defeat. You know what I mean?
Right.
And as we listen to it, we say, oh wow, this, you know, this guy's sending us an extra message along with those two words. So as players, even if we just have an 8-bar solo, that's kind of like the challenge, is to try to find the way that we can communicate these deeper musical meanings to people. So, and it's all this little stuff, how we pick it, do we use all of the pick? That's the other thing I noticed. You never changed the part of the pick that you use. You had one position. So, you know, you've got the biggest excuse in the world. You know, it's just crazy to come show up in front of these cameras and start playing. So I'm just using you as the guinea pig. And,
thank you.
And you're a very brave and courageous subject. But let's say if you were, in fact, my regular student, right? And you said, look, Joe, I want to be great, so come down hard on it every week. That's what I'd be doing. I'd be looking at every little aspect of what you're doing.
Which is what I need.
Yeah.
But this is, you know, what I've been longing for all this time, was to have that scrutiny, you know, and say, hey, okay, there's these things that you need to do that I'm even noticing now that I'm actually forgetting about while I'm doing this, right? You know?
Yeah, and it's now isn't that's also a part of performance, because we go out to perform every night, and
do you ever get jitters, or your hands are sticky, or does ever anything
well, a lot of
happen?
things happen. I mean, we're humans. We're at the mercy of the environment. Every night it doesn't sound the way you thought it was going to sound, and strings feel different, or your amp doesn't perform right, or the monitors are funny, or they're slapped back, or there isn't, or the stage is boomy, or it's dry, or it's bright, or the audience is screaming at you while you're trying to find the right pitch, and you can't hear your guitar over the people screaming at you. So yeah, all sorts of things are happening, but I think each time that you go out, once again, you want to control all these little tools that you've learned along the way, because ultimately our job is to lift people and their spirits in a performance with our music. So we have to deal with all this stuff and say, I can deal with it. I'm a professional musician. I've prepared for these moments when my strap breaks, or the amp blows up, or whatever, you know, or someone doesn't show up for the show and we got to cover for them, or whatever it might be. And you have to plow through, and the strength that you build in your musical character is what gets you over that. So it's sort of like, I can't say that, well, if you practice this, you know, one thing, you know, 3 hours a day, your hands will be strong, and therefore you will never be weak. That rarely comes into play. That's what I find. What comes into play is kind of like what you mentioned, is just like the odd thing that you never think would ever happen. That's what happens, and that's what tries to throw you off. And it's that sort of, you know, musical, I don't know, rock and roll moral fiber that keeps you standing on your 2 feet, saying, I don't care, I can keep playing, you know. This is like, I can, you know, my job
Trudge
is to,
forward,
just go forward. You know, I've covered a lot of ground. So that's really what it is. You got to cover a lot of ground. So again, without having to use Such Boogie over and over again, I would say that the obvious thing is to get really in contact with each of the scales that you're using, and then keep breaking it down and put your playing under a microscope and think, how can you get more out of this one note? Is it where I pick it? Is how much pick sticks out of my finger? What vibrato, no vibrato? You know, what pickup selection am I going to use? You know, a modeling amp is just going to kill everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes 50% of what I do and it homogenizes it. So we should talk about some other things that I think are more important, which are, there's something I used to show people all the time here. Maybe the way to do it is, if I take, like, you know what key that is? It's the 4th mode of the major scale. scale, which is a Lydian scale.
Lydian.
Now what if I go?
Is it like mixed Lydian or
See, this is really not fair of me to do this because I've hit upon your weakness immediately.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah.
Like that. To be honest with you, that's what
I'm
here
not
for.
doing this on purpose.
Yeah.
But this is what I would do. If he was a real student, what I would do is in 5 minutes, I got to figure out what have you covered before. And then I'd say,
Yeah.
I'd make a mental note, okay, ear training. We got to do ear training. We got to really work on it, right? So obviously you can play and you've got a really good sense of pitch and your timing's really good. So you're basically like a really good musician with untapped reserves.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking for those untapped reserves,
yeah,
right?
that I have untapped reserves. Not that I'm a really good musician, just FYI. Yeah, just
play that over and over again.
You know, so.
This is what I do. When I was in high school, I was benefiting from taking these music theory classes from a guy, a young piano player who magically arrived at this public school. And he taught me basically, because I didn't have perfect pitch, so he said, well, I'll teach you relative pitch, which is, call this 1. Everything else, you have to learn what this distance is and what that is.
Sure.
What that is. And we'll give it a number. 1 flat 2, 1 2, 1 minor third, 1 major third, 1 augmented fourth, 1 fifth, minor 6.
Totally, just to be able to
7.
pick it out of the air and understand where
right.
you are.
And then he started showing me the modes, which I started out playing the sing and E because it's just easier for the guitar.
That's right. And
so
pedal tone can.
Right. So the mode is like a musical set of numbers, 1 through 7, and then it keeps repeating over and over again. If we're looking at a piano, C to C, and it just goes all the way up to 88 keys, right? But if we start at D and end at D, that's a mode of the same white keys. We haven't changed any notes. We've just started and ended at a different spot. That we call Dorian. If you start on E, it's Phrygian, F, Lydian, when I started playing. 5 to 5 Mixolydian, 6 to 6 is the natural minor, 7 to 7 Locrian, hardly anybody uses that one, and 1 to 1 or 8 to 8, we're back to our octave again. So, and that's just the scales without any of the altered notes in it. Once you start altering, every scale, basically think it this way, if a scale's got 7 notes, there are 7 ways to do it, so there are 7 modes of it. So if you start with a harmonic minor, then you've got modes of the harmonic minor and so on and so forth. So that's how we get what they're not really, they're called, they've got sort of artistic names, ethnic names, Hungarian minor, you know, Phrygian dominant, stuff like that. Sometimes pentatonic scales would be called Ethiopian scales or stuff like that. But basically it's just a way that musicians can talk to each other about these scales. So if I start something, let's say, I'd expect you to hear it and go, I know that scale inside and out, in every key, all over the guitar. That's what I would ask you to do as my student.
Okay.
So the first thing would be, I have to teach you, what's that? And then do you hear a major third or a minor third? So that's your key right there, and you go, well, I have studied the fact that there are only so many scales that have a flat 9 and a major third in it, and these are my choices. Yeah. Here's the other thing that's crazy about this idea of ear training is that if I start a song, so how many notes have I given you? Really?
Well, it's 1 note, but
it's just one
repeated,
note,
yeah.
Right. So the other 6 are totally up to you. Now, if I start a song and I go, I've given you actually almost
4 or 5.
6. I've given you almost the whole scale. So when you hear these chords,
and I can hear all those individual notes too.
Yeah, sorry about this gain thing here. There you go. So each one of these chords that has, you know, 6 different notes in it, I'd expect you to get to the point where you'd go, and you'd say 1 5 1 5 1 6 3 augmented 4 7, right? And you'd be able to piece the scale together that way. So the way you do it would be, this is how I did it. I sang, whoa, what did I do? That is the coolest tone ever. Didn't mean to do that, sorry. All right, so I do this. 1 2 1 3 1 4 1 augmented 4 1 5 1 6 1 flat 7 1 major 7 1 1 I did it in G
Yes.
because that was the best vocal range
For your vocal,
from my limited
yeah.
voice, right? But it really was the beginning of me being able to hear. If you suddenly went and you said, let's jam, I'd say, I know what that is. I've
And then
heard
you-
that before. And I'd think, I know 6 scales that have a flat 9 in it, and I'd start improvising around it. So we have to get you to that point. So I would suggest you hit the internet, get some fingerings for scales in 2 and 3 octaves. Eventually, though, you have to break from the pattern. So you get like a major scale, 3 octaves, maybe going up and down in 3 different, different ways. Do the, so there's a G Lydian in 2 octaves that way, or keep in mind, no one will ever pay us to show them that, on stage, So the idea of practicing this a lot, to me, is worthless. The idea is you really need to be training the ear part. Of course, you don't want to be playing it like crap, So it's just slow it down. But you want to train your ear to understand 2 things. What is the scale? And number 2, very important, what do I think about it? When will I use it? Not when does Joe use it or someone else use it. When am I going to use it? And because as you develop an opinion about every scale, that becomes your style.
Yeah.
You want to see when you're practicing how far you can sort of open some new doors to your creativity. But I haven't come up with a better phrase than building an opinion about. I mean, I found that really works because it's not a technical term. A beginner or an advanced player can pretty much understand something like that. It's almost like if you had a metal player and you went, they might say, hey man, I'm never doing that, because that's blues and I don't play traditional blues. So the question that a player might ask themselves is, why do I hate that? What rubs me the wrong way about that, and what's the alternative? What do I want to give the world that's not that? And you have to build that up. And as you build up a sort of a vocabulary based on your opinion, it becomes the style that people recognize you on. So your practicing is building that, and I want you to think of it that way. And I would always instruct my students not to sit there and play one scale against a metronome faster and faster for hours and hours. That's a recipe for repetitive stress injury. So from being a player for a long time that you're pretty much going to be as fast as you're going to be in the first couple of years. The motor skills show up pretty quick. But your quality as a good musician is something that can develop over decades. And your brain is sitting there waiting to help you out. And your ears are just sitting there waiting for stuff to come in and enhance that whole journey of getting better and better and a better player.
And practicing to the tracks for me it invokes emotion as opposed to just mindless scales, and that's why I don't do mindless scales that way. I like to make it a little more musical, which may be bad for my practice regime because I end up taking a left turn and then going on this journey when really my whole focus was, okay, I got to figure out that scale. So I get a little sidetracked, getting lost in the music. But
Yeah. Well, let's try something here. I'll do this. I'm just going to do something really simple. It's G. And I'm just curious to see, play any kind of a melody you want in any kind of a key, and then try a totally different one. Like... one note, basically. I start off, and obviously I'm not going to be able to do open string stuff for you. Right? A little loud for you here. 7 or 8 different scales, I don't know, just playing around. And I kept a sort of a jazzy swing on it, just to figure out a way to keep something the same. So again, illustrating that if you just give me one note, I have the freedom of the other 6 pretty much. So I think I started with blues, like you had started blues, so I thought, okay, start with the blues. So I've got this. And then Lydian. And then Lydian dominant. And then Phrygian dominant. At one point I did. This is 2 ways of doing it. Either you can call that symmetrical, or I'm playing a diminished scale off of a different mode, but it's the same thing. It's just half step, whole step. But this creates, even in the simplest, this is almost like an introduction to a song, right? Just something that's starting out. I'm creating lots of different moods. So if you were, once again, we go back to the Red Velvet idea. If you were talking about what's behind, the song ultimately is what's behind the Red Velvet Curtain, and what is it? It's a beautiful woman or it's an ugly monster. That would determine, you're saying, okay, I'm going to, you know,
invoke that
sound, but so you'd ask yourself, well, what scale is the ugly monster, or what scale is the beautiful woman? Because my part's got to make this, introduce it maybe when the singer starts, or you know what I mean, or when the main melody starts. How does a guitar player learn how to do this? You know, what I did was, if I was near a piano, I'd go and I go, and I'd sit there and, you know, and I'd play it, and then I'd play the other scale. If I wasn't, I'd use my low string, and as I did earlier. You know, and I'd play all these modes, and I'd just try to sing them. Then the other thing was, I tried to sing them without any instrument around. So I'd have to just, again, if I'm starting with that G, and I'd try to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, and that would be, okay, that's my major scale. And I'd say, well, what's Phrygian dominant? And I'd have to mentally, you know, get this 1, flat 2, major third, foot, like that. And I'd be singing like that. And the idea is that your voice vibrating, you know, is a physical thing. It's a visceral lesson you're teaching yourself. And so when somebody does, your body's gonna remember that. You know what I mean? It's because you're not gonna be doing this, especially if you're performing with people. You're looking at the camera, at the audience, right? And so, but if someone in the band suddenly plays something, you want to be able to react to it, you know? So that means that not only your ear, but kind of like you have to have a physical memory of it. This guy I took some lessons from, Lenny Tristano, was really big on that. He had me memorizing melodies and solos with my voice. I had to come in and bring a record, put the needle down on the record, and sing it along, you know, with the horn player, whatever. I'd bring in, you know, Miles Davis. I would bring in Black Sabbath. I brought in everybody, you know. He didn't discriminate. But it really taught me that lesson, that instead of learning how to play it and relating to it as a bunch of fingerings and picking assignments, learn it as a piece of music as you would a listener. And then the music will come out this way, which is, he thought that's where it should become. It should become from the inside out. That's down. That would be down on the piece of paper. I would write down modes, or tell you to go out and find some. And we talk about some fingering, and but basically the idea is you have to get this ear training thing happening in your head, so that you understand when you hear somebody play Lydian, you go, I know that's a Lydian mode. No wonder it's making me feel that way.
Right. Yeah, the modes for me are like emotions, like feelings. Like, you know, some are dark and happy and moody, and so that's.
But you have to learn them. I would say this. This is very important. You have to, as a student of music, you have to admit to yourself what you don't know. Just say, I cannot play Phrygian dominant in, you know, B flat, A flat, E flat, all over without just doing the fingering I picked off the internet. You know what I mean? So that puts you on a trajectory of practice that's probably unprecedented in your life, but it's so necessary to break out of, let's say, if this is how you learn the scale, to never play that in front of an audience. They will never buy a ticket for that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
But
Understandable.
if it's E Lydian and all you do is, that's what they're looking for. They want you to show that you are completely free on your instrument to represent music in any
and
form.
not stuck in a box. Like just even be able to see them all connected laterally. That's
Right.
the thing that I need. The
Yeah,
most.
you don't want to sound methodical. You don't want to sound like you're trying to teach the audience or anything like that, right? So, but it's sort of our lot as players to somehow transcend the way that we pick these things up. They're very handy, you know, as we pull lessons from books and things like that, but we have to eventually dissolve the connection between how we learned it and how we use it, right? So let's talk about picking, though. People always come to me wanting to know secrets of picking, and it's really funny. You know, in this particular band, I've got a bunch of guitar players who are playing different instruments, right? Mike Keneally plays guitar and keyboards. He's a master guitar player. And a lot of people don't know that Marco Miniman also plays in guitar incredibly well. And they both have very fast right hands. They're right-hand players, but their hands move very differently from each other. You know, whereas Marco has a very small wrist movement kind of a thing. Mike Keneally has a more of an arm kind of a thing, more like a Petrucci kind of a thing. You know? I've stood right next to guys like Yngwie who play more like this, or guys who play like that, like Neil Schon.
Really strange one.
Right, that's almost like a Hendrix kind of a style thing. And then Steve Vai plays like this. And it's amazing when we're doing the G3 stuff, and you're going across the line, whether it's Steve Morse or Steve Lukather or Steve Vai, any Steve you can find. They can all play just as fast as each other, but they're all holding their arms and their wrists in a different place, you know. So you got to find your own thing. So it's like it's a bit of a disappointment when the students come and they say, well, what's the secret to playing fast? And I said, well, you got to figure out where you want to hold your hand, not where I do it. You know what I mean? Because different anatomy. Again, if we were not rock and roll guitar players and we were in an orchestra, let's say, we were in the Kitchener Symphony Orphan or something like that, we would simply be required to have all technique available for the conductor when he says, today we're doing Flight of the Bumblebee, and we're like, oh great, you know. If we're a particular player that's got to handle that on the trumpet or something. So we kind of get a bit of a free pass as rock and rollers. We're allowed to be more expressive and say, these are my techniques and I don't use those techniques because it's not part of my gig or something like that. But once again, if we were classical players, we sort of would be asked to learn all the techniques, wouldn't we? Because we would be representing hundreds of years of repertoire, and the conductor would pull out something from 1700 or 1900 or whatever, 1600. We'd have to react to this. So you have to eventually figure out a way to play with picking, mute picking, open picking, picking where you hear the pick, picking where you don't hear the pick, because ultimately it sends a message to the audience. When someone is in let's say a hardcore band and they go to play something and the audience doesn't hear the picking, the audience might get let down because that's what they're expecting. They want to hear the aggression in the sound of the pick, right? If you're playing in a different kind of a band that plays a variety of music, the audience may get let down because the guitar player's always going choppa, choppa, choppa every time they play something, and it's like, what's that got to do with the song? You know what I mean? So ultimately, I think we can't get off the hook on this thing. We have to learn how to play both ways. However, I think it's important to know when to use it, because the sound of the pick is something that the average listener is affected by, and the absence of the sound pick is the same way. So when we do something legato, the average listener in the audience says, wow, that sounds so fluid, it makes me feel so free. And when we pick every note and make sure they hear the scraping of the pick,
intensity, right?
Yeah, they feel that intensity, and depending on the music, it may be exhilarating or make them feel uncomfortable, whatever it is we're going for. So that's a long way of saying we've got to do it all. Eventually, I think, like, when you practice picking, it should wind up yielding something pretty, as well as things that are pretty aggressive. I'm just always afraid that people who practice picking aggressively will just write extensions of the exercises. So I'm a big fan of just learning as many songs as you can that have interesting picking that maybe throws you for a loop, and use that as your exercise rather than these, because these kind of things rot the brain. And once again, no one will ever pay to see you do that, so you might as well, you were talking about playing that, you might as well play things that are nice and that have some sort of musical content, or write some of your own. Make a point of maybe every 2 weeks just write something simple. It can be very derivative, but just something that maybe focuses on something you're having a hard time with picking wise. Do you do any arpeggio stuff? Like these I used to really hate when I was young because they focused on things I wasn't all that good at. Can't believe I played that right for the cameras. But those things, once again, you kind of play them, and they kind of, if you're looking at the guitar, they kind of lay out the major, minor, diminished, and augmented arpeggios for you, which I think ultimately was a good way to look at it. I think it kind of helped me visually see things. Oddly enough, I bought a pamphlet from a guitar player named Billy Bauer when I was a teenager that had all these arpeggios in it, and I studied them a lot. And then a couple of years later, I took a few lessons from the bebop piano player, and he was like, "Oh, don't bother playing these arpeggio things. They just sound terrible. They sound like a student practicing." He said, "What you should do is play me every inversion of a chord on a set of strings that you can." So, like for D, right, he had me doing this as far as up, as far down as I could go. He didn't care about the fingering because he was a piano player. But everything had to be right. And this, I found, was sort of a better way of being able to sort of think about these arpeggios.
And visualize them too.
And use them better.
Within chordal.
Yeah. We know as guitar players that, when you get a chord book, it shows the chord like this, but you rarely do that as a guitar player. You're usually playing little bits of chords and pieces here and connecting it with some sort of rhythmical composition. And so breaking the chords up into, starting with root, third, and fifth, and then third, fifth, root, and then fifth, root, third, is a great way to always know all your options in terms of those chords. So I would say that, and of course you want to be able to do the same thing with your minor, and you have to do the same thing with your diminished and augmented arpeggios. Great way to do it. Another thing that I would recommend, I do believe it's still in print. There's a jazz guitar player named Joe Pass, and he wrote a book called Joe Pass Chords. And what he did, for instance, on the first couple of pages, he wrote, for major chords, all these forms will work, and he wrote down no chord names. So for, in my case, C major, he may have had these, and he had simple things like that mixed in. All sorts of chords like that, We can run out of tune here. And as a young kid, I thought, oh, I get it now. It's up to you to break up the harmonic suggestion and to improvise how you fill that up, how you accompany whatever else is happening. So in rock, of course, it's a little different. We approach those spaces in a different way, but it's pretty much the same thing. And I realized, boy, what I hear Pete Townsend doing is pretty much what I hear Joe Pass suggesting. It's just they have a different sound on their guitar. And when it gets more distorted, the less notes sound a little bit better. So the Townsend's approach is a little bit more geometric in a simplified form, but bigger in sound. Joe Pass's sound was a little bit more condensed, but much more complex harmonically. This helped me get away from this.
Cowboy chords.
Yeah. They're only, you have to know them inside and out, and then got me away from this, just the simple bar chords. Once again, major, minor, seventh, 7/4, minor, seventh, minor.
Every variation within the box.
You've got to know those. But then eventually, as we said before, you have to know how to combine them, and then how to break them up depending on, you know, what you're trying to do.
Eric Johnson does a lot of that.
Yeah, of course.
He's a great, obviously.
You know, it's funny if you look at the Ed from U2 and you look at Eric Johnson, they do very much the same thing. They just, you know, use fewer notes. I think the Ed uses fewer notes, but he creates an environment without saying, you know, G add 9. He just might just do this, but it's the same.
Sounds huge, though.
It's the same musical information they're working with, you know. This will always roll back to the ear training thing, because as you're doing your chords, eventually, as if we were continuing a relationship as a student, and I said, okay, improvise a scale over this. Number one, without looking, you'd have to be able to go, I know what that is. I can pick out these notes and play the appropriate scale. And then as I would change the scale, I would expect you to be able to change with me. Right? You know what I mean? Like that. So once again, it's this, and you got to feed it, and you got to put a name against it. If you don't have perfect pitch, assign numbers to the notes. Extremely important, so that eventually what you've got inside is something that people can recognize as your own style. You know? And the physical stuff, I think, will fall into place.
I really appreciate all of that advice. Thank you very, very much.
All right, fantastic. It's going to come in a different key for me, so I can't use my harmonics. hard.
Continuing?
Yeah, keep going. You're doing a great job. jazzier, bluesier version, right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good playing. Fantastic. Did I mention he was a good musician?